Welcome back, everybody. This is a quick Friday follow-up video at the end of our second week, talking a little bit about Coraline and what's going on with Coraline. Before I get to that, though, I just wanted to make a couple little announcements about next week. We have Monday's class Monday is Labor Day, and I forgot that when I was making the syllabus. So we don't have class Monday. So what we'll do is we'll just kind of move the schedule one day back. And so we will just have Wednesday's class. I mean, I know we don't meet, but that means we'll just be doing the work for Wednesday's class next week, which means we'll be doing the short story, The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I'm betting some of you have probably read that one before. It's fantastic. But we'll be doing that for Wednesday's class. What this means is, as I said, no class for Monday. So I will drop the module for the week 3 module. I'll drop that probably Monday, and then you guys will have till the end of the week to finish that. I guess the perusal assignment will be due midnight Thursday, but I'll put this all up on Blackboard. But the big thing to know is no class on Monday, and so the module's going to drop a day later, and then we'll just be doing the one story, the Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Yellow Wallpaper story. Okay, so that's what's coming up next week. This week, just wanted to say a few more things about Coraline. Again, your perusal posts have been fantastic. You guys have been climbing all over the interesting things in this story. And so I just wanted to kind of underscore a couple of things, maybe emphasize a couple of the ways that I think about the novel. So as I suggested in my last video, my sense is that the novel really details Coraline's maturation, her growing up. Where she begins the novel is kind of a selfish child. I mean, I like Coraline. I think she's fantastic throughout, but she does exhibit some of the characteristics of, a younger child, a little bit more self-absorbed. So she begins the novel that way, and she's not really sure of kind of her place now. Things are in transition for her. Her identity's been called into question. We talked about that. But by the end of the novel, I think that she's matured a little bit. She's grown up a little bit, and she's got a sort of a stronger sense of her identity and her place. When she drops the other mother into the well, or the hand into the well, I think we might read that as Coraline ridding herself of those selfish and childlike qualities. Right? We talked about the way, in the last video, the way that the other mother functions as a kind of projection of Coraline's selfish and childlike qualities. So when she finally gets rid of her and drops her into that well, I think that we can read that maybe as her getting rid of those, or at least repressing them, which is kind of what we all do when we grow up, right? I don't know if we ever get rid of that childish stuff entirely. We repress it and we behave like adults. And it just strikes me too that the grasping hand, the severed grasping hand, I think is a nice image for the needy child in some ways, right? Give me that, I need that, I want that. So anyway, this novel is about the kind of process of maturation or growing up for her. And I think the story gives us a number of hints that this is the kind of movement that Coraline is going through. And these are some of the things I asked you guys to look at. First thing I might mention is her exit from the other house, right at the end when she shuts the door and it severs the hand, and she goes down that long, dark passage on 133. And I think the description of that is really interesting. If we take a look at that on 133, she writes, or Neil Gaiman writes, it was an uphill run, and it seemed to her that it went on for a longer distance than anything could possibly go. The wall she was touching felt warm and yielding now, and, she realized, it felt as if it were covered in a fine, downy fur. It moved as if it were taking a breath. She snatched her hand away from it. Winds howled in the dark. She was scared she would bump into something, and she put out her hand for the wall once more. This time what she touched felt hot and wet, as if she had put her hand in somebody's mouth, and she pulled it back with a small wail. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to read this as kind of, to read that long, dark, passageway, as a kind of birth canal, right? So this is a kind of birth scene. I mean, you can read it as a birth canal, also as a throat, right? It feels like a mouth. It's hot and wet, dark, long. And so I think this is a kind of passage, literally and figuratively, for Coraline. She's moving through it. She's being reborn. It's kind of a rebirth here, a transition. A new version of herself is coming out. And I think it's interesting that when she comes out, the first thing she does, she shuts the door and then she climbs into the chair of her grandmother and curls up and goes to sleep there. So the first association we get when she comes out of the kind of birth canal passageway, the transition is with an older woman, right? So connecting her with somebody who has grown older. She's moved forward a stage in her life, I think we might say. So that's one thing I think is kind of interesting there. And then, I asked you guys to think about the dolls and the picnic scene at the very end of the novel. And so on page 151, I think we get another clue that she's grown up, that things have changed for her. This is the scene where she talks about camouflage, right? She says to her mom, she asked for a blanket for the picnic. Mom gives her one. She says, "That's perfect." And then Mom says, "I didn't think you played with your dolls anymore," said Mrs. Jones. "I don't," admitted Coraline. "They're protective coloration." "Well, be back in time for lunch," said her mother. "Have a good time." That idea of protective coloration, right? We saw that earlier in the book. She's watching a TV show, and it's a phrase that describes what animals do when they use camouflage, right? When like a chameleon or something changes color to fit its backgrounds, that's protective coloration. So it's camouflage. And so now the dolls, she doesn't really care about them anymore. They're only camouflage for her. So she's only pretending to be a girl interested in dolls. Again, I think the suggestion she's moved beyond that into something older. But then it sort of gets spun out even further, because on 153 and 154, we get her pretending to be a mother figure. She's walking around talking to the dolls, telling, "Oh, you dropped your piece of cake. I got to get you another one." But she's playing the mother. So I think this is a complicated image. She's pretending to be a much younger child. So she's pretending to be the young child that's still interested in dolls. But she's pretending to be a much younger child, playing a younger child's game. But the game is one in which she pretends to be a much older woman, a mother. So you get this kind of stretching in both directions. The picnic scene seems to straddle these different stages in her life. So in that way, I think the scene is a really appropriate image for understanding the book as a moment of transition, moving from the young child to an older, more mature child. I'm interested too in that image of the severed hand grabbing the key in the middle of the picnic blanket and then plunging into the abyss. It seems like a really fraught, full image, but I haven't figured it out yet. So maybe somebody else, maybe one of you guys can figure it out for me. That would be awesome. So yeah, all of which is to say, I think we see, I like to read the novel as a kind of an account of her maturation and growing up and learning her identity and her place in the world in a more confident way than she did at the beginning of the book. But I also wanted to touch here on maybe what's a related theme, the question of kind of creativity and art and originality and copying. I pointed you guys to a section of the book where this comes up again and again, but it runs throughout the book, right? In lots of different ways. Her parents are writers, right? They're always at their typewriters or their computers writing things. Her parents are writers. She herself, I think, is an artist or writer, right? When she does that mist drawing, that's her trying to draw the mist, but she's also writing at the same time. So it figures her as a kind of artistic creator. The little songs that her dad makes up and then she sings, right? The old ladies as actresses, the old man as a kind of maestro of the mice. Everybody in the book is an artist, a kind of creative soul of some type. So I think this is a theme that the book is really interested in thinking about. Now, I really like the way a lot of you read this in your comments. You read it, a lot of people read it as a kind of contrast. What do we do with this focus on creativity? You read it as a contrast between the originality and creativity of the real mother versus the inferior copying of the other mother. So the other mother is this inferior version. All she can do is copy. She can't make anything originally. Right? And that's mirrored maybe in the fact that she can't have children, apparently. The real mother does. She can create these things, but the other mother cannot. So, according to this way of thinking, we get true originality and art on one side, associated with the real mother, and then a kind of fake copying and artifice on the other. So maybe art on one side and artifice on the other side, with the side associated with the other mother. And so, I mean, I think this reading reinforces the villainy, the evilness, the falling short of the other mother. And I like the way that it underscores the idea that this mirror image of the real world, this copy of the real world, is somehow, it's flatter, it's cruder, it's weakly imitative, right? So it underscores the nastiness, right, of the other world. It's a poor substitute for the real thing, right? At one point she says it's only the idea of a house, not a real house. It makes perfect sense to me. I like that reading a lot. However, it raises lots of questions for me, and I don't have good answers for them, but I think these are super interesting questions to pose. So that's how I'm going to kind of wrap up my discussion of the novel, is I'm going to leave you guys with a number of questions that I think get raised along these lines. The phone is ringing. Let me just pause until it's done. Sorry. It was a political advertisement. Big surprise. Okay, but yeah, so I like the reading, but it raises these questions for me. And so I'm going to leave you guys with these questions because I think they're really kind of rich and productive. The best questions always refuse to have final answers. So yeah, we have the contrast then between the other mother as the kind of weak imitation, and then the real artist on the side of the mother. But my question is, how is the other mother's creation any different than what Coraline's real parents create? I mean, I guess another way of asking the question is, isn't all art a kind of artifice? A kind of copying? I mean, isn't this whole novel just a kind of creation out of blank paper, out of the mist that Neil Gaiman has created? Right? So we think about the whole novel as almost a version of what the other mother is doing. Right? She creates a world for Coraline to inhabit. This book, Neil Gaiman's novel, creates a world for us to inhabit. How are they different? And hasn't he copied some of his book, copied some of his book from other books, like Through the Looking Glass? We're talking about this intertextuality. Isn't that the same thing as what the other mother does? Right? The line from the book, here's the line from the book, transform and twist and change. Isn't that kind of what he's doing with the stories that he's alluding to or engaging? I have even more questions, right? Many of you noticed that the other mother's house creation gets cruder and cruder towards the end of the novel. That is, at first she realizes it doesn't really look like a house anymore. It looks like a photograph of a house. And then a drawing, a crude charcoal scribble of a house drawn on gray paper. And then finally, just a small child's scrawl is what it looks like. This is interesting to me because Coraline herself has produced a small child's scrawl earlier in the book. The mist drawing. So what do we make of that, right? On the one hand, I think it reinforces the idea that the other mother is a projection of Coraline herself. She's Coraline's own mental and psychological creation, and so thus the child's scrawl is like the child's scrawl. So Coraline's creation is like the other mother's creation. But if Coraline's creation is like or equals the other mother's creation, does that mean that it is just a twisted copy? Right? Again, maybe you can sort of see what I'm getting at, or what I'm kind of circling around and not having quite figured out what it is. But I think that the novel, and this is one of the reasons that I love it, right, is it raises all these kinds of questions about the process of creativity and the process of writing. And it weaves them throughout the novel. And I don't think it gives us any easy answers about that. I mean, I think that the novel is interested in asking questions about itself and how it is itself created and how it works as we read it. So these are kind of meta questions, like metafictional questions. So there, I'm going to leave you at the end of the book with some questions to think about. But again, great job on the perusal posts. I think this stuff is fantastic. And I hope you enjoyed that book. I will see you soon.